नमस्ते, वेलकम टू आवर नेशन स्टेट डायलॉग सीरीज राष्ट्र राज्य संवाद श्रृंखला में आपका स्वागत है. 欢迎收看民族国家对话系列. I'm Dr. Geeta Kochar, moderator for today's discussion. Today it is our pleasure to have with us Dr. Ivan Lidarev, and Dr. Ivan Lidarev is an Asian security and international relations expert who specializes in China-India relations. He's currently visiting research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. He obtained his PhD in international relations and political science from King's College London. He has a rich think tank experience, having held fellowships at LSE, Ideas, and Observer Research Foundation, and also previously served as advisor at Bulgaria's National Assembly. So welcome to our show, and it's a pleasure to have you on our Nation State Dialogue series. Because this discussion is going to be on India-China relations, which is your expertise. Let me start by asking you about, that India-China had seen violent clashes in 2020, and since then, we have come a long way, and after vigorous discussions at various levels to bring a change in the bilateral relations. However, the delineation and demarcation of the boundary remains a thorny issue. So how do you see the complexity in the boundary issue, and what are the factors that hinder a permanent solution?
Well, first, thank you so much, Dr. Geeta, for inviting me to your program. It's a pleasure being interviewed by you, and kind of very, very glad that I can share my views with your numerous viewers. Speaking about the territorial dispute and its complexity, I think it's very important first to start by examining what we mean by border dispute, because very often people think of it simply put as a boundary dispute or a border dispute. That is a dispute about where a borderline should lie, 10 kilometers in one direction, 20 kilometers in the other. I think that it's much more precise to speak of a territorial dispute. And much of the complexity comes from the fact that it's a territorial dispute. That is, it involves very large chunks of territory. So if you look, for example, at Arunachal Pradesh, it's roughly the size of a small European country, actually even medium-sized European country, like Austria, for example. It has less than 2 million people in population. And if you look at Aksai Chin, it's more or less the size of Belgium, for example. So that's why it's a large territorial dispute. And some of the complexity comes from this. Another part of the complexity of the issue comes from the fact that it's not just one dispute, but a number of smaller disputes. So when we speak about the territorial dispute, it involves different disputes in the eastern sector, in the western sector. You've got Sikkim, for example. So it's a very multifaceted dispute. So much of the complexity comes down from this. Now, once we move from this kind of larger picture, I think it's important to realize that the resolution of the dispute, in some ways, it's not so complex as it looks. Why? Because I think that both sides are very much aware that there is no military solution to this problem in any foreseeable future. And they realize that there is no political willingness or political ability actually on either side to make large territorial corrections, territorial concessions from one side to the other. So essentially, this all means that the only viable solution to the territorial dispute is accepting the status quo with minor adjustments. Practically, the existing status quo with adjustments, let's say 10 kilometers in one direction or several kilometers in the other. So nothing major. So inherently, this asks the big question, why hasn't the dispute been resolved if it's relatively clear what the resolution should be? And I believe there are many reasons for this, and that's where the complexity comes. I think that in some ways, the two sides have very different incentives. If you look the dispute from Chinese perspective, I don't think that China is actually so much interested in resolving the dispute at this stage, because my conviction is that China has in many ways linked the dispute to other issues. For example, the Tibet issue and the US-India rapprochement, which China believes is directed against Beijing. So unless China sees great progress or great change on these issues, I don't think it's going to drop its claims and accept settlement on the territorial dispute. And when it comes down to India, I think that there is substantial willingness on the Indian side to resolve the dispute, because fundamentally the dispute is much more costly for India than for China. So because if you see, when there is the tensions on the border, usually there is a political crisis in Delhi, especially if the tensions are very big. I don't think that there is a political crisis in Beijing when there are tensions on the border. Even in 2020, when things really got very extreme and very deadly, I think there was much more of a crisis politically in Delhi than in Beijing. And that's because, of course, India is a parliamentary democracy, and any Indian government is in a very difficult situation when there is trouble on the border. So there is a certain imbalance in terms of the costs and political and military costs of the conflict between the two sides. However, even from the Indian perspective, I think that resolving the dispute is increasingly more difficult because it has become much more politically sensitive as an issue. Of course, for India, the shadow of 1962 continues to fall on the territorial dispute. So this is a very sensitive issue for many Indians. But then in the last 10, 15 years, you saw a gradual intensification of the territorial dispute and more trouble on the border. And I believe actually that the moment when things really became very sensitive for Delhi was actually 2017 during the Doklam standoff, which went on, I think, for 73 days or something along these lines. And I think then this really shook the Indian establishment, and I think the Indian public also got really mobilized by this issue. So I think that this was a little bit of a watershed moment. Of course, there were previous border clashes, let's say 2013, 2014, there were small border crises, but I think 2017 was kind of the moment when the territorial dispute really became a began to become a major domestic issue for India. And I think that this, of course, increased massively in 2020. So after Gawan, of course, this became a very sensitive issue. So it is much more difficult also to resolve the dispute on the Indian side now because of domestic political considerations. Now, moving from the two sides, I also think that there is another very important dimension why it's so difficult to resolve dispute and why it's so complex. And this is mutual mistrust. I think that the two sides profoundly mistrust each other. There is absolutely no trust between them. And what is worse, there have been a number of agreements in the past which have been broken. So, for example, there were agreements in 1993, 1996, and India has consistently claimed that China has broken those agreements. For example, after 2020, India claimed that China has deliberately broken those agreements, and there are various provisions about military deployments, armaments, and so on. For its part, China has claimed that India also has broken agreements by, for example, making joint exercises with the US not far away from the border. So each side has a difficulty trusting the other. So even if there is an agreement, probably it will take some time before the two sides are convinced that the other side is really fulfilling its part of the bargain. And of course, before we reach the moment when there is an agreement, I think it will be much more difficult to move in this direction, because obviously each side will doubt the commitment of the other side. Would they change in the future their position? Would they have renewed claims? So, for example, for many years, people believed that Sikkim was very much a settled issue after 2005. But then it turned out that there are also remaining issues there. For example, there is an area known as the Finger Area, which is still disputed. So one has the feeling that it's very difficult to resolve, to create necessary trust between the two sides to move toward a resolution. Now, this being said, I think that things have slightly improved recently. Why I think so? I think so because first, I think that the two sides really looked into the abyss and they got very scared after 2020. They realized that things have gotten really out of hand and that this can produce a real border conflict. I think that things came very close to a real shooting conflict on the border. And I think that now they have much greater incentives to try to make some progress on the border dispute, either managing the border dispute or even resolving part of it. So I think that this is very positive. Also, I think that China's concerns about both Tibet and US-India rapprochement have been somewhat alleviated. I mean, obviously, the Tibet issue is not what it used to be 20, 25 years ago. And as we all know, there are substantial tensions in the US-India relationship. Although one has to note that the US-India partnership, especially defense partnership, continues. And I personally believe that it will persist in the future. So I don't think that the US-India relationship is going to break. But clearly, it's not as close as the Chinese feared. So I think that they feel a little bit more at ease when it comes down to the potential that Delhi and Washington can join forces against Beijing. So I think that this creates a certain opening for making progress on the territorial dispute. Of course, I don't think that it's likely to have a comprehensive solution of the territorial dispute anytime soon. I think this is not realistic. However, one can see progress in particular areas of the border, particular sectors, for example, or parts of sectors. And actually, last year, the two sides started to discuss potential for early harvest agreements. So they created a group which will look into such early harvest agreements. And even before 2020, around 2018, for example, there was already talk about this following the Wuhan summit between the leaders of the two countries. So I think that there is a chance for this type of early harvest agreement. And just to clarify for your viewers and listeners, an early harvest agreement is kind of a relatively easier agreement, a low-hanging fruit agreement in a part of the border which is relatively less contentious than other parts. So essentially, the logic behind the early harvest agreement is let's start with the easy part, and then once we finish it, we'll move to the more difficult part. In practice, this means that most likely the two sides will try to make progress either in the middle sector or in the Sikkim part of the border. I think that there is room for improvement there, and I think that maybe there is some chance that they might reach actually a limited agreement there. This being said, though, we have to bear in mind that some skeptics here will say that actually China and India did reach an agreement on Sikkim back in 2003, 2005. So some people will criticize this as kind of, well, accepting something as agreed a second time. But nevertheless, the border actually in Sikkim was never clarified between the two sides. So in this sense, I believe that if there is an agreement there, this will be a substantial step forward. So that's what I think about the complexity of the issue and what are the chances for kind of resolution or kind of progress, at least in the future. Of course, it's very important also to mention territorial dispute. So much of the efforts actually in the last year and a half and even before has been trying to stabilize the border and kind of progress toward first disengagement and then de-escalation. And finally, in theory, the third step in this process should be the induction, but honestly, I'm not very optimistic about this. So now the emphasis should be on de-escalation, and I think that there is some progress along these lines. Also, the two sides have made a concerted effort to rebuild, or to build rather, an institutional infrastructure for managing the border. So, for example, they have these working mechanisms that they expanded this summer. They have this experts group. They have so they created three different types of mechanisms for managing the border, because the previous institutional infrastructure clearly had a great problem dealing with the crisis of 2020. So, in this sense, I think that they have made progress in managing the border, and there is even potential for some progress in partial partial resolution. But I want to stress that the big issue, the whole resolution of the whole border is very far away, and I'm not an optimist about this, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I mean, you have raised many issues out here, and let's begin with, piece by piece. And the first thing that you mentioned is Sikkim is one of the issues that has not been resolved in one sense from the Chinese perspective, right? But because we had already had an agreement which clearly states Sikkim is an integral part of India, why is it that the Chinese are going to really raise that issue at this point of time, in your opinion, and how that would impact? So let's break down to that. And my second question, as a follow-up to this, is, when we resolved this Sikkim issue, Tibet was one of the issues where we said, okay, Tibet is an autonomous region of, China. So, but Tibet is a crucial aspect of the boundary problem between India and China, as you really know. So many Tibetan scholars and even CTA states that without Tibet being a part of the negotiations, the issue cannot be resolved. So what are your comments and views on this entire Tibet issue, especially how the Chinese, look at this Tibet issue? Yeah.
Okay, so before I address the Tibet issue, just to address your Sikkim comment, if I have understood your question correctly, you meant why the Chinese are interested now in resolving the Sikkim issue. Is this what you were asking me?
No. You said that Sikkim territory has not been delineated, so boundary is still a problem in Sikkim.
Yeah.
Whereas for us, the agreement has already been reached, and the Chinese have agreed to it. So why do you think the Sikkim border problem is going to be again ignited when we resolve the broader context of India-China border problem? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, first, I don't think it was really resolved in the sense that the agreement was about recognizing Sikkim as part of India because before 2003, China, and 2005, China actually believed that Sikkim is an independent state. From 1975 to 2003, 2005, roughly, Chinese maps listed Sikkim as independent, as separate from India. So actually, the agreement between China and India in 2003, during Vajpayee's visit there, about Sikkim was more about Indian sovereignty over Sikkim, but not necessarily about the border. So in a certain sense, this part of the border, as well as the whole border, has not been agreed upon. And then over time, the issue of the finger area and some other small areas, but especially the finger area, started to emerge. Some people would say that this is because the Chinese side wanted to kind of put some pressure on India. Other people would say, especially on the Chinese side, that these issues were never fully resolved and never discussed. So fundamentally, the agreement was simply put an agreement about sovereignty, not about the specific delineation or, of course, demarcation of the border. So in a certain sense, it was never completed, but I do think that the Chinese also did try to deliberately kind of use this issue to put some pressure on India, especially after 2006 and 2008. There were different tensions. Now, going to the enormous Tibet issue, this is, of course, an unbelievably complex question. In short, the Tibet issue is so complex because it is one of the really core issues between China and India, and it involves several different questions which are part of this broader Tibet issue. And by the way, the Chinese don't like even to use the term Tibet issue for obvious reasons. They prefer the term Dalai Lama issue. But if you look at this Tibet issue, it actually includes several different smaller issues. So, for example, obviously the initial question was the place of Tibet within the People's Republic of China. And then there was obviously the question of the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama and of the Dalai Lama institution once the 14th Dalai Lama reincarnates. And then there is the other question about the future of the Tibetan government in exile on Indian territory, or the Central Tibetan Administration, as it is called these days. But historically, it was called Tibetan government in exile, by the way, and it's very often referred in this way still. Informally. And then, of course, there is the question also of the international Tibet movement. because apart from a movement in India, there was for many decades a major movement, international movement of support for Tibet, which involved prominent politicians like Nancy Pelosi, prominent Hollywood actors like Richard Gere, and so on and so forth. So it was a very massive movement. So the Tibet issue includes these issues and many others, and it is a very complex question. Now, to understand even part of the complexity of this issue, I think it's critical to start to look at the perspectives of both sides. So from Chinese perspective, the Tibet issue is a question of sovereignty. Essentially, Chinese sovereignty over not only the Tibet autonomous region, but also other Tibetan populated areas of China. Because as many of us know, actually the Tibetan government in exile and the Dalai Lama claim that Tibet is larger than the Tibetan autonomous region. And then, of course, for China, this is a very sensitive issue. It's also an issue, it's so sensitive to a great extent because obviously, foreign powers such as the US have supported armed struggle against China in Tibet in the 1950s and 60s. And after 62 war, of course, India did the same thing. And then, of course, for China, this is also very sensitive because you got the Tibetan government in exile across the border. And, years ago, I spoke with a Chinese scholar about this. And I kind of said that this government is extremely weak. It's not a real government. But then he told me a very interesting Chinese saying that I'm trying to remember now. I think it's something like Ma Jue Sui Xiao Wu Zhang Zhu Chuang. So roughly it translates like the sparrow is small, but it has all the vital organs. So in a certain sense, it might be very small, but it's still a government in exile, and it's led by a very charismatic and internationally recognized leader, such as the Dalai Lama. So obviously, this is seen as a threat from Chinese perspective. So even if the Tibet issue is, at least to some extent, more and more less important than it used to be within China, because I think that Tibet has been very much integrated in China, and I don't think that anybody seriously can expect in any foreseeable future kind of a Tibetan separatism or Tibetan independence of any sort. It is still a very sensitive issue because it's an issue of security for China. Security both inside Tibet, because obviously there is still potential for a lot of trouble. I mean, we all saw what happened in 2008 when there was massive unrest in Tibet, which very much shook China just before the 2008 Beijing Olympics. And of course, it's also a very major international issue, which can put pressure on China and kind of affect China's international image. And of course, there are parts of the Tibetan movement which are much more aggressive and much more willing to kind of take a hard line toward China. So they don't want Tibetan autonomy, they want Tibetan independence, and so on and so forth. So for all these reasons, this is an extremely sensitive issue for China. For India, this is also a sensitive issue, but in a different way. I think that India has a very strong emotional and spiritual relationship with the Dalai Lama. I mean, first, of course, there are quite a few Indians who recognize the Dalai Lama as their religious leader. But even those who don't recognize him respect his spirituality and have a very strong emotional connection with him. Also, there is, I think, a very large group of Indians, especially older Indians, who feel that India should have approached the Tibet issue in a different way. And of course, there is also a very large Tibetan community living in India, although this community has been declining for a while. So the numbers have fallen, but still it's relatively large. And of course, within the Himalayan belt, the Dalai Lama is still a colossal figure. He's a very, very important figure among all people living within this region. For example, in Ladakh, in many parts of the borderlands between China and India, he's a very key figure. Apart from this emotional connection, one can argue that for India, well, Tibet is, at least to some extent, an important political, how to put it, instrument in its relationship with China. So some people have called this the Tibet card, Xizanpai, I think in Chinese. So essentially, for India doesn't have that much leverage on China, which is a country that is much more powerful than it is. And it's not easy to pressure China, as we all know. So the Tibet issue, even if it is a little bit reduced, is still a relatively useful card for India. Now, India has never really played the Tibet card. That's a fact. But it has waved it in the air, so to speak, in order to potentially deter China, especially to deter much larger escalation. So even if there are tensions between China and India, the existence of the Tibet card in India's hands guarantees that it's much less likely that China will escalate above a certain point. Also, in particular moments, India has tried to tactically use the Tibet issue to put pressure on China. So, for example, organizing meetings between the Dalai Lama and Indian representatives, or celebrating the Dalai Lama, or kind of, for example, having a representative of the Tibetan government in Thaw waving a Tibetan flag at the Chinese across the border, which happened, by the way, at one point, I think during or after the Doklam standoff. So in a certain sense, all these are tactical uses of the Tibet issue. Now, whether they work or not is a very contested issue, but they definitely have been there, those usages. So with all this in mind, the Tibet issue is fantastically complex because it also involves a number of actors. You got, of course, the Chinese, the Indians. Of course, you got the Tibetan community, which is, by the way, in many ways deeply divided, both within Tibet and in some ways outside of Tibet. So some people, for example, support one type of attitude toward Beijing. Other people support a very different attitude. So, for example, Tibetan Youth Congress then is known to be much more hardline toward Beijing than, let's say, the government in Dharamsala. The Tibetan government in exile, so-called in Dharamsala. Then, of course, within the religious hierarchy, obviously, there are also some divisions. And by the way, this goes back even to the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. For example, there was clearly a major difference between the Panchen Lama and the Dalai Lama. Before the Panchen, I think the 10th Panchen Lama passed away, I think in the late 1980s. So, in a certain sense, there is this inter-Tibetan issue. And there is, of course, a fourth major actor in this, and this is obviously the United States, because the United States has been a major patron of the Tibetan movement and the Tibetan government in exile over the years. So one has to understand that those four actors have very different interests, agendas, goals, and they are not always on the same page. And even between actors that you might think are aligned, you see certain tensions. So, for example, there have been some tensions between Dharamsala and the Indian government, or at least I have heard such claims. It's very difficult to verify them. So it's a very complex issue. Now, looking forward to how things would develop on the long run is very difficult to say, but I would argue that the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama would be a very critical moment. A moment when either things will start to escalate and we'll have a much larger confrontation between China and India, or potentially you see a certain downgrading of the whole Tibet issue. So it won't exert such an influence on China-India relations, and by the way, on the territorial dispute. One thing which I forgot to mention is that there is a very close organic connection between the territorial dispute and the Tibet issue. Because if you look at many of the agreements about the territorial dispute on which the claims of the two sides are based, they're based primarily on Tibetan documents. And then, of course, the Tibet issue played a very major role in the conflict of 1962. And then, obviously, there is also another element to this whole thing, namely the Tibet. Well, at various points, there have been tensions. Tensions in Tibet have also been transported into the territorial dispute. So when Tibet has not been stable, or there has been contestation on the Tibet issue, you see kind of also tensions on the border. At one point, for example, China canceled the special representative talks because of a conference in 2011 that the Dalai Lama was organizing in India. So there is close connection between these two issues. Looking forward, most likely, I think that there will be two Dalai Lamas, one in Lhasa, which will be who will be China supported, and probably one in Dharamsala. And then, of course, India would be in a very complex position because, I mean, it's obvious that it will have to accommodate and in some ways recognize the one who is in Dharamsala, but still, how can India do so without provoking a huge crisis in its bilateral relationship with China? That's a very big issue. So it's also important to think how the two sides can manage this whole thing. And there have been some people, like, for example, the Indian diplomat and former foreign secretary Shyam Saram, who have actually suggested even an informal dialogue between the two sides on this issue. So the period after the reincarnation will be a very kind of critical period for China-India relations and for the territorial dispute. And based on how things will develop during this period, the relationship can go in one direction or the other. So it will be very, very interesting to follow. And by the way, it's also important to realize that because of different reforms that the Dalai Lama has made within the Central Tibetan administration, the so-called government, Tibetan government in exile, practically now there is a separation between the institution of the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan administration. And for this reason, there is also the logical question whether the Central Tibetan administration will survive actually the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. What would be its position, let's say 15 or 20 years after the reincarnation? So this is also a very big question. So there are many questions, not a lot of answers, but both sides, both China and India, need to think how to manage this extremely explosive issue, because it definitely has the potential to create a very large crisis in their relationship. The only good news is that they have had a lot of time in which to prepare for this. So probably they have contingency planning. I hope also that there has been some type of dialogue between the two sides of how to manage such a reincarnation. But we'll see.
Okay, so what you were talking about the Tibet issue, I think two things come out from this. One is that you talked about the post-Dalai Lama thing, right? You mentioned about the problems between India-China relations, but I'm also concerned about how the Chinese within Tibet will have a problem with this new, two kinds of post-Dalai Lama scenario that you're talking about. One which would be in India and the other which would be, appointed by the Chinese. That's one thing. And the second thing that I'm really interested to know in terms of the, the Tibet issue that you're talking about is how do you think, the other, Tibetans, which are basically the overseas community, how do you think would they react in terms of these two different post-Dalai Lama scenarios?
Well, it's very difficult to know, of course, how they will react. And of course, one doesn't need just to think about the Tibetans, but the broader world, both the Buddhist world and the larger international community. So my suspicion is that once the reincarnation happens and there are two most likely candidates for the future Dalai Lama, one in China and one probably in Dharamsala in India, then of course you see a competition which side will, or which country and which group of Buddhists and which part of the international community will recognize which of those two candidates. So there will be a very fierce competition. And I think that both sides are in many ways laying the groundwork by reaching out to different Buddhist communities, practicing Buddhist diplomacy, and trying in different ways to put themselves in a position which will facilitate the recognition of their candidate for the Dalai Lama. And this is especially true for Beijing. I think that Beijing has invested a lot in kind of preparing the groundwork for international recognition of their candidate, of the Dalai Lama. How the Tibetan community abroad will react is very difficult to tell, but my suspicion, suspicion is not the right word. My guess is that most of them will probably support the candidate in Dharamsala, although nobody knows how this will play out, and one can imagine very substantial divisions within the Tibetan community internationally, but also in India itself. And one can see some precedents with this, with the Panchen Lama or the Karmapa. So in a certain sense, we don't know how it will play out, but most likely there will be division between the Tibetans within China and the Tibetan diaspora. But we'll see.
Yeah, and to my second question about how the Chinese, you think, would react to this, to different kind, the Tibetans, especially in Tibet today.
How the Chinese will react within Tibet?
No, how the Tibetans in Tibet will react.
Well, that's extremely difficult to tell, simply put, because we don't know. I mean, one can imagine different scenarios how this can happen. On one hand, one can imagine protests and instability inside Tibet. On the other hand, one can imagine kind of divided loyalties. It's very, very difficult to tell because one needs a very good understanding of regional dynamics inside Tibet, and this is very, very difficult to do. Probably some Tibetans will accept the leader in Dharamsala. Probably some will support the official one, the Chinese supported, the Beijing supported one in Lhasa. So it's very, very difficult, and also much depends on the specifics of the two candidates. When they're announced, how acceptable they will be, how they will be presented, to what an extent even the Tibetans within the People's Republic will know about the other Dalai Lama. So there is also a bit of an information issue. So all these are kind of open questions.
Okay, so I mean, let's move a little beyond this, border problem or the boundary issue that you've been talking about. I mean, we see that on the political, diplomatic, and economic and trade relations between India and China, there's a great progress, basically. So, do you believe that the relations will remain on an upward trend, or there are factors that can hinder the smooth progress in relations? And if there are certain factors, what do you think are the important, or you can flag those factors that can really hamper this smooth development of India-China relations? Yeah.
Okay, so I think that in general, I'm an optimist about the improvement in China-India relations. Excuse me for a moment. In general, I'm an optimist about the improvement in China-India relations. Of course, during the last year and a half, they had a very successful Thaw in their relationship. And I think that this Thaw has more or less achieved its objectives. It has managed to restore some normalcy in the China-India relationship. But there is also a lot of room for improvement. I think that the improvement in relations will continue primarily for three reasons. First and most important, I think that the two sides realize that unless they keep improving their relationship, most likely they will go back to the frozen relationship of 2020 to 2024, and inherently this can breed conflict. And of course, the costs and risks of such a frozen relationship and such conflict are enormous. So I don't think that they want to go back. So in this sense, there is a strong negative incentive to improve relations. They just don't want to relapse into conflict. Now there is also another factor. A much more positive factor. The economic benefits of better relations have not materialized to the moment, or at least have not sufficiently materialized to the moment. So China, on one hand, wants access to the rising Indian market and wants its companies to become part of the shift of supply chains to India. So it has a very strong incentive to try to court economically India. On the other hand, India, I think, is very interested in Chinese technology, Chinese investment, Chinese know-how. So there is a lot of potential for growth in this field. And by the way, as we are speaking now, there are persistent kind of claims that India is close to opening, to removing some of the restrictions on Chinese investment, the so-called, which were based on the so-called Press Note 3 of 2020. So this is likely to generate kind of further economic progress in the relationship between the two sides. And there is really a very, very substantial potential in this regard. And third, I believe that the international geopolitics are going actually to push forward the relationship between the two sides and are going to kind of incentivize them to keep improving relations. Obviously, India has been deeply shocked and shaken by the strain in its relationship with Washington under President Trump. And obviously also China sees an opportunity in kind of restoring some normalcy and some goodwill in its relationship with India as a result of this. Also, China itself is worried by the unpredictability of the Trump administration. And while the US-China relationship has somewhat stabilized now, of course, on the longer run, their competition is going probably to keep going. Some people even describe it as a Cold War. So in this sense, China also has very serious incentives to stabilize and improve its relationship with India within this global context. So the global geopolitics are going to probably keep on pushing China in India to improve to keep improving their relationship. And one has to also realize that the last year and a half has produced a toll, but still the relationship is at a relatively low level of development. So there is a lot of potential for progress. Now, what are the obstacles? The obvious obstacles are that none of the fundamental issues which divide China from India have been resolved. Neither the Pakistan issue, nor the territorial dispute, nor the Tibet issue, nor the water issue. So there are many issues which have not been resolved and which can generate renewed tensions between the two sides. And then, of course, there is the potential of unforeseen circumstances and events or developments. So, for example, a renewed conflict between India and Pakistan, or, for example, a crisis related to Tibet, for example, if the Dalai Lama passes and there is a reincarnation crisis, or, for example, if there is, God forbid, a crisis surrounding Taiwan. So one can imagine a lot of issues that can create obstacles or even derail the improvement in relations. But in general, if things stay relatively stable, I'm an optimist about the improvement in relations. And I want to stress that during the last year or so, this improvement in relations managed to survive one conflict between India and Pakistan and the controversy surrounding the Dalai Lama's announcement of his reincarnation plans. So there were two challenges, and the improvement in relations managed to successfully overcome both and continue. So this gives me certain optimism. Also, I think that ironically, we'll see in the foreseeable future a paradox in the China-India relationship. What do I mean by this paradox? On one hand, I think that now that they have taught their relationship, the two sides are going to move to a much more active engagement, which I think would be much more productive. However, this also means that they'll start engaging many of the contentious issues which they deliberately decided to disregard during the Thaw. So in a certain sense, their relationship will become much deeper and more productive, but also more complex, and therefore progress will be more difficult. So, for example, if you look at economics, probably their trade and their investment relationship is going to move forward. But then this inherently would mean they'll have to face issues such as the trade deficit between the two sides, or, for example, Chinese transfer of technology to India. And all this, or kind of in what sectors of the Indian economy the Chinese will be allowed to invest. Because even if the restrictions, the PN3 restrictions are loosened, as it seems very likely, there will be critical sectors of the Indian economy, strategic sectors of the Indian economy, where probably Chinese involvement would be either not allowed or it will be kept at a minimum. So inherently, this will create certain tensions. So the more they improve their relationship, the more complex it will get. In a certain sense, it was very easy to thaw a frozen relationship in a way. But now that the relationship has been thawed, it will be more complex to move it forward. But still, I believe that they will move forward. So I'm an optimist about their overall relationship.
Okay, let me just put you the last, question. In terms of the global order, how do you see the change that is happening in the multipolar world? India and China are going to be the major crucial actors into it. So what is your assessment on how their bilateral relationship can shape and alter the global changes? And what role would the US and Russia play in this dynamics?
Well, of course, when we speak about the change in the international order, of course, we're not completely sure what this change is. So, for example, some people claim that we're moving toward a multipolar international order. Others claim that they are moving toward a bipolar international order in which China and the US will be the two poles. Some people even claim that we're still in a unipolar world, which is still dominated by the US. And of course, you can imagine a world with no polarity in which there is just chaos. So it's a little bit difficult to say, but I personally believe that we are moving slowly toward and very chaotically toward some type of multipolar arrangement. But this won't be a very stable multipolarity. It will be very chaotic. So how would this affect China-India relations, and how China-India relations would affect this? This is a very big and complex question, but in general, I believe that the relationship between China and India will have a very big impact on how this multipolarity develops. So if China and India have a good relationship, or relatively good relationship, because we have to be crystal clear, China and India would remain competitors and rivals, and their relationship would not be rosy. There are too many issues of fundamental tension between the two sides. But if their relationship is relatively positive, I think that they can cooperate in kind of shaping this multipolar world. Probably they can institutionalize it. They can work in institutions such as the SCO, G20, the BRICS, and in some ways kind of advance and institutionalize this multipolarity, and also reduce to some extent the inevitable instability which will be linked to the emergence of the multipolarity. Now, if their relationship, however, is much more tense, I think that this transition to multipolarity, this multipolarization, if you wish, would be much more chaotic, characterized by greater instability and probably even more conflict. And of course, it will be slower, because if China and India have a very tense relationship, India by definition will be pushed toward the US. And of course, this will slow down the process of the emergence of multipolarity internationally. Now, what role does the US play in all this? I would argue that the US inherently is in tension with this multipolar world, because it wants to restore the unipolar world that existed before. But India is in a difficult situation when it comes down to all this, to a great extent because India has developed a special relationship with the US over the years. And even now, with all these tensions in bilateral relations, India still very much needs the United States. So in a certain sense, India is a country deeply torn in two different directions. On one hand, it promotes multipolarity, and I think it believes in multipolarity. But then on the other hand, some of its policies inherently ally with the main country which opposes multipolarity internationally. And this inherently creates tensions with other powers which promote multipolarity, which means China, but also Russia, and even countries like Brazil and South Africa. So India is in a very complex position. I think that this position is in many ways a function of its multi-alignment, which I think is a very good and ambitious foreign policy, which I think has delivered a lot to India, but inherently it comes with its own risks and difficulties. And I think that specifically on this issue, when it comes down to balancing between China and India, between American attempts to restore unipolarity and attempts by China and Russia to build multipolarity, then India is in a very complex situation. So that's in some ways the inherent costs of multi-alignment. Now, when you think about multi-alignment more broadly as an idea, I would argue that, or as a policy, I think that it both unites and divides China and India. It unites them because I think that both Beijing and New Delhi ironically share a lot of ideas about how the world should operate, how a multipolar world should operate. So they emphasize the role of major powers and the respect toward their core interests. Let's say Xinjiang for China or Kashmir for India. They put a greater emphasis on national sovereignty, on spheres of interest where their interests have to be taken into account by other great powers or by the smaller countries in their own neighborhood. I think also that in their understanding of multipolarity is also based on a greater role for the global South on the international stage. So in this sense, ironically, the two sides have a lot of similarities of their vision of international relations. It's much more based on sovereignist nation-state ideas and much less on universal liberal values. And ironically, I think that this also creates a much closer, not ironically at all, I'm afraid, sorry. In many ways, this creates also a very strong bond with Russia, which in many ways is also another country which tries to promote this multipolar vision of international relations. And ironically, I think that Russia is a very major kind of third party in the two sides' attempt to promote multipolarity because it's their partner in the SCO and BRICS, but also it's a trusted third party. Both Beijing and Delhi, I think, trust Moscow much more than they trust each other. So in a certain sense, Moscow is a major bridge between China and India when it comes down to promoting this multipolar vision. Now, of course, there are limitations to this because obviously Moscow has a much more revanchist understanding of how the world should develop. It is in a very serious conflict with the West and especially with Europe. So in a certain sense, it has a much more revanchist view of the development of the world order, as opposed to India, which has a much more evolutionary view. But in general, I think that Russia is a factor that kind of pushes China and India toward greater cooperation on multipolarity. However, one also has to bear in mind that multipolarity also divides China and India, because if you look at their visions of multipolarity, India is very focused on multipolarity in Asia, which practically means less China. And obviously China has a very different understanding of how Asia should work. It sees itself much more as the leading power in Southeast Asia, maybe even in South Asia, although we're not sure about this. So that's why, for example, if you look at the Tianjin summit, actually India spoke about multipolarity in Asia, while China spoke in general about multipolarity on the international stage. And when President Putin visited India in December, the joint statement actually included a reference to multipolarity in Asia, which inherently is a dig at China, which is in many ways the main challenge to the emergence of multipolarity in Asia. So multipolarity not only unites China and India, but also divides them.
Okay, so let me put you the last question, which sums up almost everything about China-India relations, is your suggestions and comments for India-China relations, for future bilateral relations, as well as their role in Asia and the world in order to make it a better and peaceful, place for the whole mankind. I mean, because this is what both the leaders have been talking about, shared vision for the mankind, or, Vasudhaiva Kutumba, those kind of notions or political statements are being made by both the leaders. So how do you see that is possible and what they need to be doing?
Well, obviously, this is an extremely difficult question and very complex one, but I would say that the first thing that China and India need to do is to focus actually on their, not on their global relationship, but on what divides them, on the contentious issues in their much smaller bilateral relationship. Because I don't think that the global relationship can advance if they don't resolve things like, for example, their water issues, their territorial dispute, their problems when it comes down to Pakistan. I think that these issues inherently undermine China-India cooperation on the global stage. So I think that it's very important for China and India to focus on these issues in order to build a kind of a more effective and more positive global relationship. And also, I think it's very important for the two sides to move beyond multipolarity and increasing the role of the global south to kind of other international issues, global issues on which they can cooperate. So you can think of climate change, you can think of AI, you can think actually of arms control. Especially nuclear arms control, because this is increasingly becoming a very important issue internationally, including in Asia. But then, of course, then the two sides will run into a very major obstacle to their cooperation because they are deeply unequal. I mean, if you look at the balance of power, it's very clearly in China's favor. So, for example, if you want cooperation in artificial intelligence, China is one of the two AI superpowers in the world, and I'm afraid that India is way behind. If you look at nuclear weapons, for example, China's arsenal is much bigger and much more survivable than India's. And China is in many ways competing with the US, not so much with India, although, of course, India is also a major security consideration. So in a certain sense, it will be difficult for the two sides to cooperate because of this imbalance of power, because very often this means that China, does not treat India as an equal, something which of course India very much resents. But then also China's objective power and ability to change international affairs and affect the global order is also much larger than India's. So creating a balance in which the two sides can cooperate on an equal basis is a difficult thing. And I think that if they start to cooperate now, very often it will turn into a situation in which either there will be very severe limits on cooperation, or the Indians will be forced to lean much more toward the Chinese position on many of these issues. So in a certain sense, the big question about their future global cooperation comes down to two major issues. First, how fast the gap between China and India will be reduced on the long run, which practically means how fast India will be able to grow. And I think that India is rising. I'm a big optimist about India's rise, but still the gap with China is very substantial. Of course, maybe after a while, China will start to lose some of its position, but still, I think that their lead is very large. So India needs to kind of accelerate its rise and its growth in order to reduce this. So one factor is the speed with which the gap between China and India will be reduced, and the other factor is the extent to which China will be willing to accept India as an equal and treat it as an equal. Because sometimes I have seen kind of a Chinese attitude in which India is not treated as an equal, and it's not treated in some cases even as a great power. So inherently, this creates very serious roadblocks to cooperation. And I think it's very important for China and India to cooperate, because when you think about the emerging world in the next, let's say, 20, 30, 40 years, there will be two of the three most powerful countries in the world. China would be number two, or maybe under some circumstances, number one, and India most likely will be number three. So in this sense, it's critically important for the whole world and for humanity in general, for these two powers to be able to cooperate and to work together on setting up the global agenda, particularly in a world in which things are in a state of flux very much because of technological change, because of regional conflicts, because of economic tensions. In a certain sense, we're living in a much less stable world than, let's say, 20 years ago. So that's why I believe that it's very critical for Beijing and Delhi, and actually Washington, these three great powers, to cooperate. And of course, to this, you have to add also other major powers, such as Russia and the European Union. So it's very critical for major powers kind of not to allow multipolarity to run amok, but to create what one can call a concert of great powers, which work together in order to create stability and address international problems.
Very well said. I mean, it was very interesting to have your discussion. Thank you very much for taking so much of time and, explaining a lot of things that your perspective or some of the Chinese perspective, give to us. And thank you very much to our viewers. Please keep liking and subscribing our channel. And I hope many more such interesting discussions will come up. And thank you, Dr. Ivan.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being on the show. Thank you.